Hello and welcome to this video lecture. Our objectives in this lecture are to understand and explain how the Enlightenment influenced the political system of colonial British America and the United States, and to understand and explain how certain political events, documents, and institutions in the British American colonies influenced the political system of the United States, including the founding of the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the establishment of American chattel slavery. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back. Let's start with the roots of American democracy and the connection to English political heritage. The first American colonies were established by English settlers, and so understandably there is a tie to English political heritage, and that includes a tradition of representative government, which goes back to the establishment of a bicameral parliament in the 11th century, the establishment of a tradition of limited government, which first emerges in a proto-form with the Magna Carta in 1215, in which the English nobles forced King John to respect some of their rights. Also, the rule of law is something that stretches back into English history with common law tradition, that is the type of law built upon precedent and case law. And then in English history, there has been some effort at different times to respect individual rights and civil liberties. And a couple of noteworthy instances would include the Petition of Right in 1628, which was a response by Parliament to recognize certain civil liberties after King James I was attempting to shut down Parliament and move toward more of an absolutist regime model. And then the English Bill of Rights in 1689 marked the move to a constitutional monarchy in English history. And so the 17th century, meaning the 1600s, is a very important time in the development of the American political system for several reasons. First of all, English civil conflict is going to directly affect the colonies. The English Parliament's battles with the monarchy will eventually lead to the Parliament becoming more powerful. We have the first privatization with the first corporations through colonialism. Protestant Calvinism will lead to extremism and separatism, which will then lead to Puritans migrating to the American colonies. British involvement in the trade of enslaved people. The 30 Years' War in Europe, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, and then first instances of ethnic cleansing, which is going to really start in earnest with King Philip's War in the 1670s. There are other roots of American democracy that come from European philosophy during the time period in the 17th and 18th centuries known as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a backlash against the rise of very powerful monarchs in Europe who believed that they had the divine right to rule without any checks on their power, and this was known as absolutism. And so the Enlightenment is a rejection of that, and instead it is a focus on Greco-Roman examples of more political independence. Also, the idea of liberal democracy, which is actually going to come from several sources, including native sources like the Iroquois Confederacy, and also John Locke, who is an English philosopher. He'll establish some of the first notions of popular sovereignty, the right of the people to change their government if that government is abusive. And then by the last part of the 18th century, right at the same time of the American Revolution, the idea of economic freedom and free trade with the idea of capitalism, which is established in the ideas of Adam Smith. And by established, I mean first really articulated. It had been previously already established. And so all of these influences are going to lead to the rise of something known as representative democracy. Now, this had existed in history before, of course, quite memorably with the Roman Republic, but this term, representative democracy, really is going to first emerge in the 1790s. And so now we have the idea of representative government, meaning people are elected to represent the rest of the population, like I said, that had existed in the Roman Republic, but now it's going to be fused with the idea of democracy. Together, that will become kind of a new development out of the Enlightenment. Now, there is a contradiction here because, as James Madison will articulate, representative democracies are, yes, better at serving the public good, but we really don't want too much of that democratic influence in our representative government, because if we let too many people get involved, says Madison, then it could become chaotic. And the will of the masses, which he regards as not very educated. In fact, a lot of the founders were a little bit skeptical of the will of common people. They believed that potentially they could be influenced by demagogues. Other roots of American democracy are going to come from these early colonial governments themselves. And early forms of self-government are expressed as early as 1619, which is when the colony of Jamestown in Virginia establishes a town council. That's the first example of European-based representative government in the English colonies. And then the following year in 1620, the Mayflower Compact is really the first form of written limitations on government, because the colonists on board the Mayflower, before they disembark, write down all of the rules and expectations for the community that they're going to create when they get off the ship. And then pretty quickly over the next few decades, as other colonies are established and grow, we have the first colonial constitutions, including the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties in 1641, and then another noteworthy constitution for one of the colonies is the Pennsylvania Frame of Government. And what's interesting is that 70% of the rights contained in the U.S. Bill of Rights can be traced back to colonial tradition, meaning that they come from the colonial constitutions themselves. And there's quite a lot of overlap with the English Bill of Rights as well. So, basically the English Bill of Rights, the colonists themselves kind of experimenting, treating these colonies kind of like a lab in democracy, is going to establish a tradition that will be invoked when the U.S. Bill of Rights is ratified over 100 years later. Most of those rights that will show up in the U.S. Bill of Rights can be found in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, so that is kind of the most significant out of the colonial constitutions. And in general, these rights were broadly more liberal for free settlers. They included freedom of worship, rights for the press and assembly, rule of law, and due process. And there's going to be a strong focus on literacy in the colonies, which comes from Protestant tradition. And there's a respect for academia. And this is going to lead to the establishment pretty quickly of the first universities in the American colonies, including Harvard, which is the first in 1636, and then William and Mary in 1693, and then Yale by 1701. And this is important because out of these universities will come a very learned group of colonists. And, by the beginning of the American experiment with the American Revolution and then the U.S. Constitution, as you can see, more than 100 years have gone by the time of the American Revolution since the creation of the American Institution of Higher Learning. And many of the founders would have gone through one of these universities, mostly Harvard. And many of them had education in the legal tradition. And that's going to help them when they get to the point of crafting the Constitution and just approaching the founding of the country in general. So kind of going back, all of these things from the religious aspect to the creation of colonial constitutions, which are inspired by that English legal tradition, all of those important factors are seeding the ground, so to speak, for what's going to grow up into the United States over 150 years after the creation of self-government in Jamestown. Now, there are other important things to cover when it comes to describing the creation of America's political system and political culture. And one of the main factors that we need to consider is the rise of chattel slavery. And I say chattel slavery because that refers to the trade of enslaved people as property and that status being hereditary. Early on, the colonial labor system was based mostly on indentured servitude, which was basically a contract system in which somebody would sign a contract for 5 to 7 years, depending on the contract. Typically, this would help pay for their journey from Europe to the American colonies. Once the contract was over, theoretically, the laborers would be then freed to move around and basically be able to do whatever they wanted to. The majority of people who actually come to the American colonies from the 1630s to the 1770s were actually indentured. The majority of the white immigrants, I should say, are going to be indentured. At first, however, before the 1660s, there are both European and African indentured servants that come. The first enslaved Africans came in 1619. And what ends up happening is, for a variety of reasons, there's a shortage of indentured servants coming to the American colonies starting in the 1660s. And some of that is probably related to the end of the English civil conflict that had begun in the 1640s and really ended in 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy. And so there were possibly, there was less conflict happening, so people didn't necessarily want to leave England or Europe quite as much. And so because of whatever factors are involved, there's now this shortage of indentured servants coming. And this is really, the 1660s is really when the American system of slavery will really begin to start developing into what we'll recognize later on in the 1700s and 1800s. Many of the colonial framing documents did permit slavery with restrictions. In fact, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties is the first to include clauses permitting slavery. In the 17th century, slavery is in every colony. And so we can see that with the clauses in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And there are a couple of other things that are happening. The indigenous population throughout the American hemisphere had been devastated by disease and by European colonialism, harsh treatment. There were indigenous people who were enslaved in the American colonies. In fact, John Locke, who is an important Enlightenment philosopher whose works are actually going to inspire some of the words in the Declaration of Independence, actually wrote some of his most important works to try to justify the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Carolinas. And so by the 1660s, we have this decline in the arrival of indentured servants. And by 1662, Virginia enacts an important idea, which is the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. Now, previously, through English common law, children would take their father's status, and that would include people who were enslaved. And what ends up happening is, by changing it to partus sequitur ventrum, now a child's status matches their mother's status, and this is going to give a lot of power to the planters, to the slaveholders of the American colonies. And then in 1663, the very next year, King Charles II is going to issue a charter for a new slave trading company. And by the end of the 17th century, Britain is going to be the country most heavily involved in the trade of enslaved people. And so more and more enslaved people of African descent are now arriving in the American colonies at this point. And then about 15 years later, there is an important event, which is Bacon's Rebellion. Now, Bacon's Rebellion has several aspects to it. The purpose was basically to attack and ethnically cleanse the colony's indigenous population. So the purpose was certainly terrible. Nathaniel Bacon, who was a member of the planter elite, came to the colony's governor and basically said, "Hey, you're not doing enough to kick the indigenous folks out of specific regions. We want to take over that land." And when the governor, whose name was Sir Berkeley, when he didn't really respond, essentially Bacon puts together a militia. And this militia is made up of European and African individuals from working class backgrounds. Many were indentured servants. They were they mingled with one another. They often intermarried. They saw each other as equals. They were unified. They were from the class of people that did not hold property. And so because Bacon used this group of people to staff his rebel militia, it's going to now become a symbol that's threatening the power of the planter elite. Long story short, the rebellion fails. Bacon actually dies. The folks in the militia are rounded up and punished. And in the aftermath, what happened was the planter elite decided to think more strategically. And so they decided that these landless folks, once they get out of their contracts, were causing trouble. And because they didn't have land, they would get restless. And so they were a potential source of dissent. So the planters decided that they would give some more land to these folks. They would get certain privileges and they would get certain jobs. At the same time, the planters increasingly began to turn towards chattel slavery. And they also began creating legal definitions between white people and black people, including formal segregation. And this was all embodied in the 1705 Virginia Slave Code. So, before we talk about American independence, that was what happened in the 1600s. Both the creation of colonial constitutions, which are kind of like experiments in democracy, but at the same time, we also have the displacement of indigenous peoples. One other event that happened in the 1670s was King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War. King Philip was the name that the English settlers gave the leader of the indigenous tribe that they ended up fighting. His real name was Metacom. And this was a conflict between the English colonists in New England and the indigenous tribes. And it was a pretty bloody, brutal conflict. And it was won by the settlers. And it represented another advance toward a loss of rights for the indigenous peoples. And with the rise of chattel slavery, by the time we get to 1700, we have now seen certain distinctive traits of the American political system begin to emerge. A focus on individual liberties for white settlers, the establishment of hereditary chattel slavery for people of African descent, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. Now, flash forward when we get to the events leading up to the American independence, which begin with a backlash against taxes imposed after the French and Indian War, starting in 1764, and then spiraling into more resistance, and then kind of a reciprocal harsh crackdown by the British. This happens over a period of 10 years, and so by the time we get to 1774, the colonies are on the brink of rebellion, and what happens is the founders start looking for some type of justification, and they find it in the words of John Locke, who invokes something in his own writings known as the social contract, which is this idea that out of a state of anarchy, which he called the state of nature, humans got together and agreed to give up some of their absolute rights to a government that would provide them security and protect their private property rights. So part of the social contract said that if that government became abusive, under the terms of the social contract, the governed could overthrow the government and create a new government. And the founders liked this idea. This directly was something that they could use to justify breaking away from the English monarchy. So they also get the ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is an almost verbatim lifting from Locke's terminology. The idea of this consent of the governed, meaning a government can rule as long as the governed give their acceptance. And this idea that there is a higher power, there's a natural law that enables the governed to do this. And so when we finally have the American Revolution, Enlightenment philosophy, the experience under British martial law between the decade at the end of the French and Indian War, and then all of the other things happening in the 1600s, those are all going to be mixed into what the colonists will draw upon to write the Constitution.